Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. For many years now, I've told you about how these foreign troops and foreign organizations will go to these third world countries after some flood or hurricane hits, and they go for so-called relief missions. And then, years later, we predictably hear about how during those relief missions, these European soldiers were over there raping all of the black women and girls they could get their hands on, and nothing is ever done about it. And the white media treats it as a one-and-done story. They give one mention to it. That way, if any black people say, you guys never cover this stuff, they can point to it as a CYA maneuver and say, see, we did a one-and-done story about it. It was 5 seconds of the news cycle, now be quiet. Well, in Africa, the British, they've been over there raping the women there for decades. I ain't talking about the 19th or just in the 20th century. I mean today. Kenya's government is corrupt as hell and a gang of bootlicks, which is why no matter how repressive they are towards their own people, you never see these white governments nor the white media making the kind of wild and almost completely false type of accusations that they did against Robert Mugabe or Idi Amin or Hugo Chavez. If you've seen my video, The Truth About Robert Mugabe, which you can find on YouTube, I'm sure, then you saw my breakdown of the minor acts of election-related violence that took place in Zimbabwe compared to the out-and-out massacres that took place in Kenya, and how the British and the US and the white media went full Neanderthal about Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe, but totally ignored Kenya. And why is that? Because the regime in Kenya plays ball with white supremacy, while Robert Mugabe, albeit late, stopped playing ball with them eventually. The violence in Kenya was acceptable to white power because it's being done by a puppet for Europeans, and that violence is how these corrupt regimes stay in power, so it's all good. But the British are doing more than just extracting minerals from Africa. They're also using Africa as a place to train their soldiers, too. And for decades, those British soldiers have been raping the women in Kenya and even getting them pregnant. Even the white supremacists can't push back on that one because it's hard to claim that they're not having sexual intercourse with those women and girls when they're having what are clearly biracial children in the blackest place on earth. And for Kenya's corrupt leaders, clearly the virtue and the dignity of their women and girls is pretty cheap. Pennies on the dollar, you could say. Kenya's corrupt autocrats only get a mere $400,000 a year from Britain for the privilege of having these rape gangs come to their country and violate their women and girls. And what about the men in these countries? You have these colonialists coming to Africa in the 21st century and doing whatever the hell they want to this day like they've always done for hundreds of years, in places where Africans are the majority and allegedly the government, and nobody's lifting a finger to bring accountability on their own? See, in Niger, there was an alleged coup that took place. At least that's what the white media and the white authorities call it. And the US and the white media have been calling those people all kinds of names and talking about how allegedly corrupt Niger's new regime is. But the coup leaders in Niger threw the US out of their country. So I'd like to know what's the Kenyan government's excuse. Not one of these British rapists has gone to prison or been punished or even been made to pay child support. The British government has of course categorically denied all of this, and they say that they've investigated themselves and predictably found that none of their soldiers has done anything wrong. What a surprise. But it's not just British soldiers. French and even US soldiers do the same kind of things over there. This is why so many of those Europeans are so jolly in the behind to get to these third world countries. They don't have any sort of creature comforts, don't even have any white people over there, and yet they're sitting there drooling at the mouth going, oh man, can't wait to go over there to one of those places. Yeah, because they've heard about how their fathers, uncles, grandfathers, older brothers, and other assorted perverts have been raping women in those places for decades and getting away with it. And they want to try it too. White supremacy makes rape an institution, a protected institution. And of course, their commanders and governments, they know all about it, and that's the entire point. It's part of how white supremacy shows its dominance, by reminding these Africans that their people are subjugated and that these white supremacists can come over there and do whatever they want to them. And I don't like to say it, but it certainly doesn't help that a number of those women over there had consensual relations with some of those British soldiers. See, that's the kind of thing that gives those guys cover to hide behind. They say, well, there's no rape going on over there, and even if there was somebody having sex, well, it was certainly consensual. You can't say it was rape. You have some individuals who are looking at some of those children that they have as being anchor babies. That would be their key to actually getting out of there, or at least that's what they think. And what they find out is white supremacy has no permanent plans for any of them. That's what they find out. Because for the women over there who might have thought to themselves that if they go ahead and have one of these British soldiers' biracial children, that would give them some sort of automatic pathway to citizenship for themselves, what they found out was those British courts looked and said, well, soldier what's-his-name over there says that he doesn't know who you are, and you know what? We don't know who you are either. He says he ain't got a connection to you, and we concur. That's how it actually plays out, no matter what they may say publicly. Oh, they've got some laws on the books, or they have some sort of rules and regulations in the British Army. Well, the question is whether or not they're going to actually adhere to them. And they don't. When Barack Obama became president, did the Kenyans, who were so proud of his father being from Kenya, ever bring this up? In 8 years of his presidency, did anyone ever mention this? Because this mess has been going on since at least the 20th century, and yet they haven't said a word. And they didn't even say a word about this. It was outside people who did. Speaking of bringing things up, South Africa ran to the World Court to stick up for Palestine, but none of those African nations has lifted a finger or said a peep about what black Americans are enduring here, though they do send a steady stream of bootlicks and tethers over here. And those same African countries have never brought suit on behalf of Kenya's women and girls or anyone else. They don't get a full head of steam about any of that. African nations try to attack black Americans for being subjugated when we're literally outnumbered 6-1 over here and are in control of nothing. Meanwhile, these white supremacists are over there in Africa decades after these places claim to have gotten their independence, and yet we can see that they're still over there raping, pillaging, and plundering as if nothing had changed. Half the Africans are fleeing Africa, and the other half are cowering in fear. That's not an insult, it's just a fact. How can you be the majority and have control of the police, the government, the military, and nobody's standing up for your rights in what's supposed to be your country? Attacking black Americans is a distraction, just like the white supremacists do. Everybody attacks us to distract attention from their own failings. And when you look at situations like this, it becomes clear why they do it. This is beyond embarrassing. That this stuff is being allowed to happen decades after independence by governments that claim to be of and by the African people of these lands. They should have been raising holy hell about it. They should have been doing just like Niger and telling all the British troops, y'all all gotta leave. They should have been putting pressure on these British corporations. Any sort of land grants or land rights or leases that you hold are officially revoked. Any sort of diplomatic personnel have to be forced out. Instead, Africa's misleaders have done nothing and said even less. But we gotta be honest though, it's the Africans themselves, the people, who also bear some of the blame because they keep tolerating leadership that does not respond to any of their needs. Even when they're being raped, their leadership doesn't say or do anything. And then you have these tethers who come to the US and they bring that same mentality here. This is why they have no problem running interference for white supremacists who harm black Americans. The tethers will be the first ones jumping in front of the camera to defend it. That's because they're used to getting their teeth kicked in, and they figure we should be used to it as well. Sadly, they have a lot of practice when it comes to just meekly, quietly suffering white supremacist violence. Well, we don't. The tethers are in no position to say a peep about black Americans. Talking tough to us means nothing. The whole world can see what's happening over there, and ignoring it won't make it go away or make it any less embarrassing. This is why Pan-Africanism could never work. In order to have global black empowerment, there can't be any weak links in the chain. And the links in Africa aren't merely weak. They're broken at this point. It's hard to claim that the Brits and the other Europeans are the former colonial masters when they're still able to go over there to Africa, freely exploit and take advantage of the land, the economy, and the women and girls any way they want, any time they want, just like they did before so-called independence. It's bad enough that black women and girls in Africa are being violated with impunity, but it's even worse that their leaders and even their own people are ignoring them. Anyone who wonders why colonialism happened in Africa and why it took so long for there to be any sort of organized resistance against it, this is why. And keep in mind, you have people from Asia and the Middle East seeing this as well, and they're lined up going, okay, we got next. After the Brits are through, we're up next. One can only hope that the Africans eventually get around to putting a stop to it. I mean, it's supposed to be their country, right? Because their dignity matters to them, at least it should. But more than likely, the only reason that they might do something about it is because some white media outlets humiliated them by telling the world that this is happening there. And if this is the response that the Africans are going to give to their women and girls being mistreated like this, they might as well go ahead and tell the Brits to come on back and start running things officially again. At least there would be less hypocrisy in that. good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Russell Richardson, Cyberdyne100, Otis Pimpleton, Wesley Monroe, and Cheryl Tate. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.